So, with Hegel, which is our reading probably for the next 5 to 6 weeks, I would like to, finish the preface in, a couple of sessions from now, right?
Sure.
And also make remarks where the preface is playing out. It plays out in the whole book, but I would like to talk about that. Then I would like to read sections from Sense Certainty, right? Crucial sections, and I'm going to actually give you sentences instead of, you can read through the whole book, but we're not going to have time to do, like I said, this would be, 20-something weeks at least to get through it,
Right.
understandably and work with it. So anyway, we will do, a reading of consciousness, the section of consciousness, probably in 1.5, 2 sessions. Then I want to concentrate on self-consciousness, especially that section from 104 to 138.
Okay.
Yep. And then I want to actually look also at the question of reason, but reason especially when individually takes itself to be real and in and for itself, which is pages 236. And I'll write this up, of course, to 263. And then we would read some of Self-Alienated Spirit. And I thought what we could do too is look at the Enlightenment vis-a-vis Kant, this section on the Enlightenment, which is 328 to 340 to 354, and of course absolute freedom and terror. I'll give a commentary on religion, but I don't think we really should read that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And we'll look at the process of absolute knowing. Now, my thinking is to make it more contemporary. First of all, we'll read maybe 2 poems by Mallarme, right? I would like to do. And I also would like to read Derrida's classic essay, The Pit and the Pyramid on Hegel, and I'm trying to find a piece called The Age of Hegel, right? These two pieces of Derrida. The Age of Hegel is a very good moment about how you would temporalize Hegel in terms of the closure of Western metaphysics.
Cool.
Yeah, the closure of Western reason. So I'm going to put that up on the board, that we have the closure, right? And then the culmination of the Western. We'll be looking at the dialectic, both of the history of philosophy, the philosophy of history, and the internal and external dialectic, all in this process, how this unfolds in Hegel's work. Right? Okay? So again, so in this light, we will read, and who, in my opinion, again, Derrida is the only person that is really thinking through the abyssal plane, if you will, or on the edge of the Hegelian system. And this is very important. We'll also maybe speak to Hegel and Lacan, which is one of the reasons I gave you the handout, the Pit and the Pyramid. My Derrida. Hegel's semiology. And then we will probably read The Age of Hegel as well.
Is that Derrida as well?
Yes, both of Derrida. This I'm going to have to find. This I have, it's in Margins of Philosophy. This is,
is there a poem by Rimbaud as well?
yes, we're going to read Democracy,
All right.
which is one of his more interesting dialectical poems. Yeah. The Throw of the Dice and Democracy by Rimbaud. course, is probably Joyce, especially in, the Finnegan's Wake, which, leaves the reader, who knows the wordplay and all of this, but, and certainly Ulysses, we could think of it that way. So I want us to keep this in mind. One of the reasons for German idealism, and one of the reasons to study it today, is to look at the closure of Western metaphysics. Hegel brings absolute knowing and absolute idea to its culmination through a reading of the history of philosophy and its dialectical, movements and transformations. And I would like to try to get you to think in terms of spheres and also interconnectedness. Okay, so try to think that way when we're reading Hegel. We're looking at how things are, interrelated, interconnected, and we're thinking about a spherical dialectic that will proceed pretty much like this. And I'll do a little diagram of it, and you can also see this in the Kojève, where each of the, once you go through the Offen book, it's going to move upward into new spheres. You're going to be unfolding into new spheres in terms of the Offen book. And I'll talk more about this too as a strategy, a methodological strategy. Okay? So I want to put up two major things. We're going to talk a lot about the concept. Right? We're going to talk a lot about the idea. And we're going to talk a lot about absolute. Right? And then we're going to talk about the difference between system and method. I know I'm giving you a lot here, but I want you to be, at least in terms of some anchoring points, to think through some of these words, this terminology. Method, the path, and then the building of the system, right? And what's systemic to it.
You're just saying we're going to talk about all those things. Not
Yes,
today.
going on to no, we can't do this. I mean, we could if we had multiple hours and food. So we're fine. But I'm just trying to general outline about this whole notion of German idealism and how it's related to today. And of course, the dialectic, right, as part of the method, what is the Hegelian dialectic, right? We'll certainly ask that. And how does this work?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we're going to do is talk about shapes of consciousness in history. Because really this book, which we're about ready to delve into, is really about the science of the experience of consciousness. Coming to consciousness and being conscious. And taking the journey from the beginning, of an idea to absolute knowing and kind of completing this long, long journey. So in some ways it's a philosophical Bildung roman, it's almost like a philosophical novel, but systematically. So it's philosophizing. It's not a novel. There's not a narrative here only, right? We want to go against the narrative. Okay, let me go to the Kojève just for a second, the letters, and then we'll proceed into the preface and talk a little bit why the preface. So these are letters that were unpublished until this person in 2016, Jacques-Alain Mallarme, must have related back in 1935. And this is the second year of Kojève's famous lectures on Hegel, the introduction to the reading of Hegel. And these are the lectures that went on 1933 to 39. For me, a fundamental moment in the history of Hegel studies. And in a way, it was a radically different interpretation, not a textual commentary like Jean Hippolyte, but a radical interpretation of Hegel. Okay, so, and Lacan was present at some of these lectures and obviously made a friendship with Kojève as well. So you can see some of the people that were there under Kojève, right? Georges Bataille, Merleau-Ponty, Eric Weil, who wrote the first book I mentioned on Hegel in the State, in the French context, Michel Eddy, the great French anthropologist, also the writer of the book Manhood. and then regularly attended. And Kojève, was in Paris from 26 until his death in 68. He died in May of 68, right? And he became the author of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or known as GATT, pre-international trade agreements that we have today. Okay, so you can see there's an introduction here by this Juan Pablo Luchetti, but the Lacan letters, and the one I like, right, in a sense, is the conclusion after the letter, right? You can see the letters begin on 337, but he says the earlier Lacan, page 336, is especially marked by the contact with Kojève and by the singularist theorist course on Hegel. The effect could have been passive. Lacan was on the lookout for theoretical tools in order to be able to comprehend both madness and psychoanalysis. He grasped that Freudian theory was not yet sufficient to understand the Freudian discovery, and one sees how Lacan might have been contemplating a work that one could call Freud with Hegel. Now, we may read this course in some ways as filling in psychoanalysis with Hegel as well, right? This could be an interesting move we could make, as well as the Derridian moment of being on the edge here of the closure of Western metaphysics and how to work through that. Are we going to deconstruct, right? Or are we going to take the path of language, right? And this interior dialogue with the pre-Socratics. So I'm trying to work as well with Bruno's course on the pre-Socratics that you come to, and we can inform me about this as we go forward. There seems to be two major paths that are being operating here in contemporary French philosophy or French reading of German texts. One path is that of attempting to bring psychoanalysis and Hegel together, through a Kojèvian, Lacanian, movement, right? And to make it look, like it's a philosophical Freud, rather than just the, quote, scientific or positivistic Freud or the biologist Freud, etc. This is one path that we're going down in terms of also the master-slave dialectic. And also within that, we are also seeing another path of Derrida living on the edge of the Hegelian system, right? Still deconstructing as much as he can to demonstrate this closure of Western metaphysics, which means, essentially God is dead, the hypothesis of both Feuerbach as God as anthropomorphic, projection, certainly Marx, right, as an opiate of the people, religion, even though Marx never really talks about God, he talks about the Prometheus as his patron saint, and then of course Nietzsche, the word God is dead, which is a seminar that he gave from Heidegger. So Derrida is working on that edge of the end of metaphysics, and how do we, weave our way back into a kind of immanence, right, into the present, and if that's really possible, presence, right, in some ways. Derrida does not think so. On the other hand, we have the Heideggerian move, which is to go the way of language. Language as the house of being, to have a path created that will allow us for an interior dialectic and dialogue with that of the ancient Greeks. So we have these two kind of paths. One that people have called nostalgic from Heidegger, that he wants to go back to the pre-philosophical, pre-systematic attempt of the Greeks. Hegel could be the last Greek in some ways, right? And in some ways could be considered the last representative of Greek philosophy. And Heidegger wants to go back to the island philosophers or to the pre-Socratics. And secondly of all, that this has been called nostalgic, right, by some people from the Derridian camp, and by others, right? I'm not so sure. Can we really presence, that moment? How much immanence can we get to it? This is a question we'll ask between Parmenidean being and becoming. In Hegel, the interesting thing to me is you're always in an active process of becoming. This is a very interesting thing. I want you to pick up on movement here rather than static, fixed concepts, right? And I put up the word concepts. I'm going to refer to something called the patience of the concept, the passion and the patience of how we ultimately conceptualize. So these are two paths I want to consider, in a sense. The Derridian move while we read the Pit and the Pyramid, right? And then, of course, the Heideggerian temptation, and also within the Derridian moment, the extension of Kojève with Lacan to psychoanalysis, Hegel and psychoanalysis. So this is sort of the thrust of, why to read German idealism today. Also, its role in Marxism, but that's been really battered around for a very long time. So I'm trying to look at this more, quote unquote, philosophically than only through the eyes of political economy or, political theories such as Bertell-Oman or, David Harvey and these kind of things. So let's try to look at it more philosophically, how the concept formation is really taking place. What does it mean to us? So if you look at this, the effective and passive Lacan was like, for us, the 43 was not yet sufficient, and one sees how Lacan may be contemplating a work that one could call Freud with Hegel, right? So this Hegelian influence has been a major moment with Lacan, page 337. He fall within the shadow cast by an ambition that surpassed that of standard psychoanalysis, and the group that met at Lacan's house, his initiative, suggests us the existence of a quest not limited to seeking university knowledge, but also, and really to the contrary, the vital performativity that characterizes all emerging knowledge. And I think this is very important. One can easily suppose that only the war brought an end to this first period for Lacan, marked as it was by the reading of Kojève, undertaken by theorists searching to understand the emergence of Napoleon. I want to say that this author is right. It's the emergence of Stalin, not Napoleon for Kojève. You can correct that. I mean, I'm certain of that. Napoleon is, code word, for Stalin.
Is this Lucelli or Miller? Or
This is Lucelli, right. Then the letters begin, 5 letters, and you can see Lacan and his address, head of the clinic at the school. 149 Rue de la Pompe. His telephone and by appointment. I'm expecting you at dinner. I'm very grateful you're willing to give me your time and your insights on a subject that affects me so deeply. Devoted to you, Lord, Lacan. The next letter he sends, and it's interesting that the correspondence is not put here by Millier, just the letters to Kojève, right? I take the liberty of reminding you, you're welcome to remind us at all times. So really all you're getting here are invitations, right? And then warmly yours, and then you see the third letter is devotedly yours, right? Since you are not free this third, I realized I could delay for 2 weeks the date of our resumption of our periodic meetings. This next one will take place on Monday, May 20th, and I will be very happy if you could honor, right? To bring me with your presence. It would be a great pleasure for you if you thought to bring me the text Glauben and Wissen, and this kind of is supportive, if you will. If you go to the end, the footnote, the footnote number 24, right? The title of Hegel's early work, right? And he's very interested here in Hegel, you can see, right? In the early Hegel especially. So then I hope I can contribute to the working discussions, right? Etc. Again, Lacan and Raymond Queneau. Did you see Zazie in the Metro, the film ever? Zazie in the Metro? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Raymond Queneau wrote the novel. He was a novelist and Kojève's sort of secretary. Bataille was the other one who was very close to Kojève in terms of recordings. Right? So anyway, I thought this would be interesting. I think that the introduction is kind of interesting. The relationship that went on, right? You can see on joint text on Hegel and Freud, page 331, Elizabeth Rudinesco informs us that Kojève prepared a text on Hegel and Freud in collaboration with Lacan, right? To whom the manuscript, the information is given by Dominique Offray, who wrote a very good book on Kojève, probably the best book on Kojève that I know of in French. And it was divided into three parts. And this is very interesting. The genesis of self-consciousness, how do we come to consciousness? It's the beginning, right? And self-consciousness, this reflective, reflexive, activity, right? The origin of madness and the essence of the family, right? And thanks to diverse, we can unravel the chronology of each chapter in turn and see. So the genesis of self-consciousness was given in the first year of Kojève's seminar 1933 according to the notes, and was then published in the journal Mesures, right? There was notes of preparing for the course of 33. The origin of madness comes from a commentary that Lacan was preparing for Kojève, right? Lacan's 33 years old at that time, right? In this letter, Lacan proposes to Kojève, we might set an appointment for preparing the passage from the Phenomenology on Madness, and I want to read this. I want to read the chapter on, I have extensive notes on Hegel and madness. I do want to engage this, very much so. Yeah, and I will be as honored to collaborate with your commentary as I am desirous to make use of this to the greatest extent that I can, right? And it was Kojève who questioned Lacan about madness in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and the latter was going to advise him on the pertinence of the Hegelian position. So I want to say also, to the margins of this text, we're going to also read the section on Antigone in Hegel, which is very famous as well, on the family. So you can read this, in terms of the text itself. What's going on here is self-consciousness, which is in the part B, right? In pages 104 through 138, right? This is the section he talks about, the genesis of self-consciousness. It comes out in the seminar. The origin of madness, we're going to see that at work vis-a-vis reason, right, later on in the text. And we're also going to get this the question of Antigone in that as well, madness, and then the family too in the Antigone story. You can see ethical action under spirit, and I want to read that, human and divine law, man and woman, and then ethical action, human and divine knowledge, pages 266 to 279. We'll look at this carefully, right? So I think this is a good kind of set of markers and anchoring points for our purposes. We're all interested in this era of being marked as the era of self-consciousness that begins with René Descartes and ends with Hegel, culminates. We're still suffering from this, if you will, ourselves. We suffer, right, in some ways, and the self still remains as a term in many cultures, even though we're getting new terms such as subject, subjecthood, subjection, and of course now the trans-individual, right, and from Simondon and others. So we're beginning to see these new kind of conceptualizations coming on. And then the singular, the universal in particular, the question again, does it exceed the Hegelian system? And what does this language actually do in terms of keeping us, up to date in post-modernity or whatever you want to call this era at this point. The return of barbarism, maybe, or a new age of barbarism. So the family would be very interesting too. The discourse on the family. The first double bind to me is Agamemnon in the Iliad. Agamemnon is faced with a crucial choice of deciding between the state or the family, and he chooses the state. And this is very much of a Hegelian problematic that he takes up, and of course he is killed by his wife when he returns from the war because he sacrificed their daughter in order to get the winds going, right? Yeah. So this is interesting, and that kind of. So it's the first double bind. Do I, go to war? Do I work in terms of the state, right? Or do I subscribe to the family values? Inverted very much in Antigone. So you go from Agamemnon and, you know, and ultimately the Electra complex, who basically gets vengeance on her mother for, you know, killing, you know, her father, right? Using her brother as an instrument. Then we go to Antigone, where we see the reverse happening, where Antigone is completely bound to the familial and the divine law. So we, from Homer to Sophocles, very interesting, the part of the trilogies. And we'll talk about that in terms of the ethical space and following one's desire, you know, in a way, since Kojève is the first thinker in my knowledge of Hegel and desire. You know, this is really what, you know, is happening. The drive for recognition, for status, for prestige, but it's also the drive in the Freudian categories, you know, I think you were there when I put the drive in terms of its levels, you know, for Lacan, you know, and for Freud, the rereading of Freud. So anyway, I think this is very interesting, and I don't know if you've read, but Lacan wrote a piece called Family Complexes. And I don't want to turn this only into Lacan, but I think it's very interesting, this influence that's going on. Hegel's presence not only was a presence in the Marxist tradition, but people forget, and we need to remind ourselves of this, that Hegel played a very important part in the forming of French psychoanalysis, especially during Vichy and then post-World War, you know, psychoanalysis, and against the dominant roles of French psychoanalytic societies headed up by Bonaparte and others, by Marie Bonaparte, you know, who was a descendant of Napoleon, right? As well as she was the person who sold jewelry or some of her jewels to give Freud passage from Germany into France. You know, you could buy passage, where the famous story of Freud is spoken. You know, what did you think of the Gestapo? He says, I highly recommend them, right? When he crossed the border. So anyway, all right, so family concepts with the place of the family and the phenomenology. So these are good, again, textual markers, if you will, to think through sort of, you know, new problematics, you know, vis-a-vis the reading of Freud, of Hegel. So then the yearbooks, etc. So I ask you to read this. You know, you probably get a lot out of this commentary, but you see Lacan's decorum and humility before Alexander Kojève, 1902 to 1968, Kojève.
It's just always fun to hear him be coherent for a second.
Oh, this is the first time you saw me?
No, I have.
We're cooking dinner tonight, huh?
Yeah.
We're cooking dinner tonight, huh? Come on over, right? That's good. Okay, good. So I hope you like this, and you know, it's just a little extra thing. And Richard Lettis told me he'd be here tonight, and it reminded me to make photocopies of this because he wanted a copy of it. Okay.
Great.
I asked you, last week we did the what is enlightenment, to recapitulate. I think, you know, what are your, you know, major, if you will, takeaways from the piece on what is enlightenment? I think we did a very, you know, thorough analysis of doing archaeology of the present this way. Yeah.
Yeah, and we had 2 readings.
Yeah.
I thought that was good too.
Yeah, good.
So
Okay.
I still sort of stand behind mine.
Sorry?
I still sort of stand behind mine, but
Oh, okay,
I
you're
appreciate
reading
yours.
another?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no
Yeah.
problem. Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah.
But it was good.
Yeah, good, okay. I mean, you know, our question is, do we live in a pre-enlightenment age now? You know, is this a big advance, or is this something, you know? And again, this is a question we still have today. And this is a kind of, if you will, a kind of precursor to German idealism.
Yeah.
Right, in many ways. Yeah, this notion of the Enlightenment, and he has a whole section on what the Enlightenment in that period is. This is someone who read Adam Smith, David Ricardo, loved Diderot. He read Rimbaud's nephew. This was a highly educated person, not just a quote technical, you know, school-oriented philosopher, Hegel.
Right.
You know, yeah. So, I mean, if you're interested too in following up on Hegel, I will mention, you know, there's the 2 books in the Marxist tradition which are very significant early on, are Lukács's book, The Young Hegel, and Marcuse's 1941 piece, Reason and Revolution. The young Hegel is an essay on dialectics and economics, and the other one is, really a study of the rise of social theory through Hegel. So these are two authors who take up very seriously the problem of reason in history, from Hegel. Whereas the French, Kojève, primarily, takes up the master-slave dialectic or lordship and bondage very actively. So you have, again, divisions in the text that create paths and paths of research that are, quite different in some ways, but also very important for our own thinking today. So you can see the two Marxists are interested in the question of reason. Right? The psychoanalysts are more interested in madness, desire, family complexes, etc. It's kind of interesting. Kojève with Lacan, and as I mentioned again last week, Jean Hippolyte, who sensitized the whole generation to reading this. If you want to read one very good essay on Hegel, Logic and Existence by Jean Hippolyte, it's a great introduction to the work of Hegel. Okay, so why don't we go on to Hegel? We'll do some work tonight. I want to also just mention a couple of things. Some of the thematics we may talk about vis-a-vis novels during the period is the law of the heart, how you rewrite Pascal, that the heart has its reasons in the Phenomenology. So to me, that's a rereading of Pascal. Absolute freedom and terror, where Kant's second critique is put into practice. Robespierre and reason, right? We have that going on, and the supreme being. And then the beautiful soul of Rousseau, right? So this is very important. Three basic things that are going on in terms of character, if you will, and characterizations, right? And absolute freedom and terror is, of course, a reference historically, in a historicist sense, to the Directoire and the reign of terror during the French Revolution. But one could also read this in terms of the show trials, right, that are going on as well, right, in the Soviet Union, right? So this is interesting too. Out of this may develop another great book that's worth writing. I'm sorry to do this, but I think it's important. Adventures of the Dialectic by Merleau-Ponty. Which was also very much. And then we're going to talk about shapes of consciousness too, and what that means historically to Hegel, what's going on. Okay? So obviously he's the great representative of German idealism and why we need to read him the most, right? And okay, so maybe we should just go dive into the text. Is that fair enough? Yeah? And look at what's happening there? Okay, good. All right, so let's turn. First of all, on the preface, why do we begin with the preface instead of instead of going to the text itself, which Hegel wrote? Because the preface he wrote afterwards. Okay? Remember that the preface was written afterwards, after the entire Phenomenology was built. Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering, because it would be very contradictory if it wasn't from the way he talks about it.
Right. So our strategy is to read this, quote, prospectively, if you will, through the preface forward and to see the intertwining. For example, Aronowitz will take this and read the 72 propositions, and that's what they're doing with Hegel, and you take a very long time to do this. Because each of these propositions unfolds, if you will, within the text itself. And we'll try our best to see that at work. I'm looking for very extensive notes on the
Is the outline of the book more or less? Is the outline of the book more or less the preface?
Well, it's also the movement of propositions.
Right.
It's the movement of propositions in the thing. Right, exactly. Yeah.
So Stanley only reads the first 72 propositions.
Yes, that's what he focuses upon, in a sense.
Interesting.
Hippolyte recommends reading the introduction,
Yeah.
which are propositions 73 through 89.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
And he starts his book there, right, with the introduction.
Hegel starts his book with the introduction.
No, Hippolyte.
Hippolyte starts his book with the introduction. Right? Yeah.
Genesis and whatever.
Genesis instruction
Yeah.
in the Phenomenology. Okay, so let's take a look at the preface, etc. The first thing that is really striking, I mean, is the preface is on scientific knowing. I don't like the word cognition. This is really about knowing. Because cognition plays too much into the English, cognitive psychology, and processes of cognizing that are really not knowledge, because he's really looking at knowledge, scientific knowledge, in a different way than most people would approach us. So let's read it. Let's get acclimated to the way he writes. So he's writing this after the fact, right? After the completion. It is customary to preface a work, to say beforehand, with an explanation of the author's aim, why I wrote the book, and the relationship in when he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, and this is important, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading. You don't say why you're writing the book. Give the explanation. For whatever one might appropriately be said about philosophy in the preface, say a historical statement of the main drift and the point of view, the general content and results, a string of random assertions and assurances about truth, none of these can be accepted as the way in which to expound philosophical truth. Also, since philosophy moves, and this is important, essentially in the element of universality, which includes within itself the particular, it might seem that here, more than any of the other sciences, the subject matter itself, and even in its complete nature, were expressed in the aim and the final results. The execution being, by contrast, really the unessential factor. And what is he saying here? The end is the beginning. The beginning is the end. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? On the other hand, in the ordinary view of anatomy, and he gives an example, obviously, from the sciences, say the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as inanimate, we are quite sure that we do not as yet possess the subject matter itself, the content of this science, but must in addition exert ourselves to know the particulars. Further, in the case of such an aggregate of information which has no right to bear the name of science, an opening talk about aim and other such generalities is usually conducted in the same historical and uncomprehending way in which the content itself, the nerves, the muscles, is spoken of. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that along with the employment of such a method, its inability to grasp the truth would also be demonstrated. So let's see. Do we work oneself out of philosophy? Do we basically, as philosophers, we have to go beyond the common, the ordinary. At the same time, we have to also think about work ourselves out of taking anything for granted, right? The philosopher's position is a suspension in phenomenological terms of any natural beliefs or any things we've taken for granted. So let's just go on a little bit more, and I'll extrapolate a little bit. Furthermore, the very attempt to define how a philosophical work is supposed to be connected with other efforts to deal with the same subject matter drags in an extraneous concern, and what is really important for the cognition of the truth or the knowing of the truth is obscure. The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity. This is also taking things for granted. The more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be accepted or contradicted, and hence it only finds acceptance or rejection. It does not, and this is a very important passage, it does not yet comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth. In fact, what happens in most treatments of philosophy is they become fixated, Descartes, right? Kant, right? Leibniz, etc., right? Instead of the unfolding of the truth as a whole. Right? It's very, very important to keep in mind. But rather sees it as simple disagreements. I agree to disagree with you, says the nice professional philosopher.
Right.
Hegel, this is bullshit. Complete.
And it's true.
Right. The bud, and I like this relate, bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. This is dialectics at work. Very interesting, right? Yet at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity, in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is necessary as the other. And this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. Right?
So this is basically the dialectical method right here. Already.
It's beginning to see the dialectical method, right?
I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
Essentially, that's
Right.
the movement is from the supplanting of
Right. And he uses this example of the
Mhm.
fruit
right.
and the blossoming of the bud. But
Which I think is what maybe
it's unfolding. Yes.
one of the clearest moments where I think he says it actually.
Well, that's probably true. I mean, you're supposed to read after this. No. The idea is to read from here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know, that you're beginning to see this unfolding yourself.
Yeah.
You're beginning to see this really interconnected system at work, you know, through these resolutions of dialectical tensions, or the setting forth of the tensions, and then ultimately their resolution.
Yeah.
Okay? So let's look at it again. Okay? But he rejects the philosophical system, the new philosopher does not usually comprehend what he is doing in this way. So in a way, his method, right, is not dialectical like mine, is what Hegel's saying. And he who grasps the contradiction between them, the historian of philosophy does not, as a general rule, know how to free it from its one-sidedness or maintain it in its freedom by recognizing the reciprocally, and this is important again, dialectically, the reciprocally necessary moments that take shape as a conflict and seeming incompatibility. Okay?
Yeah.
So 1 and 2, dismantling that you should not work, set up your work, what motivates you, what your aim is. This is against all this kind of confessional writing.
Right.
You know, this motivated my work, I want to thank so and so. You see what he's doing here, in a way, bypassing that and saying, you know, philosophy is something very different. And in a preface to philosophy, because this preface is really to his philosophical method and system. And, you know, next week I'll separate that out for you, you know, when we get a little more deeper into it. You know.
System and method, you said?
System and method.
Okay.
We're going to go through that. Okay? So, then, and this next part is very, very essential, number 3. Demanding and supplying these superficial explanations pass readily enough as a concern with what is essential. Where could the inner meaning of a philosophical work find fuller expression than in its aims and results, and how could these be more exactly known than by distinguishing them from everything else the age brings forth in the sphere? Yet when this activity is taken for more than the mere beginnings of knowing or cognition, right, when it is allowed to pass for actual knowing, then it should be reckoned as no more than a device for evading the matter itself, or the real issue is how Miller translated, Vitasaka self is the matter itself, right? The matter itself. A way of creating an impression of hard work and serious commitment to the problem by actually sparing oneself both, right? Kind of interesting. You begin to see the beginning of ideology here too. Ideological systems at work versus that of philosophical systems or doing philosophy.
I mean, my impression of
Yeah,
that is
go
that
ahead.
he's taking on Kant directly in these sections, but do you think it's more, is it the whole tradition, or do you think it's more?
Well, I think it's
responsive?
all the tradition, it's not only Kant.
Yeah,
It's the whole tradition. He's trying to, set straight, multiple things here,
okay.
including his friend's, romantic notion, and we'll talk about this more later. Fichte, on the wealth of material and intelligibility, and of course Schelling, who scorns intelligibility and looks at rationality, immediate rationality and divinity.
Okay.
So he's really in some ways trying to take away from intellectual intuition,
Yeah,
the intuiting of things.
yeah,
And this follows in some ways of Kant's slogan, intuitions without concepts are blind.
right,
You know,
okay,
it's
so in
just
some
kind of
ways
interesting
he's picking it
As a
up too.
continuation. Yeah.
Okay.
But we'll try to take it slow. I mean, I'm sorry, again, this is, I'm apologizing for our lack of time, but,
Well, it's okay.
this is something that is so dense, right, in some ways, but once you get through, you begin to see a lot of the movement at work, this is the hope here. So, the real issue is not exhausted as stating its aim, and this is interesting, but by carrying it out, by praxis. Nor is the result the actual whole, but rather the result together through the process by which it came about. Okay? Again. Yeah, but rather the result together with the process through which it came about. The aim by itself is a lifeless universal. So he's taking on intention and aim. He's taking on teleological thinking in some ways here as well. Just as the guiding tendency is a mere drive that as yet lacks an actual existence. And the bare result is the corpse which left the guiding tendency behind it. Similarly, the specific difference of the thing is its limit. It is where the thing stops or where the thing is not. And you begin to hear the is and the is not here of Parmenides. You can begin to hear this. The concern with aim and results, with differentiating and passing judgments on various thinkers is an easier task than it might seem. For instead of getting involved in the real issue, this kind of activity is always a way beyond it. Instead of carrying with it and losing itself in it, this kind of knowing is forever grasping at something new. And this is the culture at large.
Yeah.
Instead of laboriously working through, the past, etc., we're always grasping at what's new. And this is, of course, how planned obsolescence, commodity fetishism, things being out of date, all work. Right here in this paragraph, yeah.
I mean, even reading, no one reads anymore, they just summarize, right? They
Yes,
just read the summaries.
Yeah. Nobody's reading experientially.
Right.
In a way, it's a gloss rather than a, experiential internal reading, right? So remember, key words here, I just point out in this text, is activity is always at work, right? And he's also trying to demolish the ideological in the name of the laboriously philosophical, right? In a way. And also saying that philosophy is not only just a series of disagreements, right? That the history of philosophy is not about a series of disagreements. I disagree with Professor David Hume on, my sense impressions and the certainty of some of these. And, we'll see this in the way he works and sense certainty, perception, and things like that, force and understanding. Okay? So anyway, this kind of knowing is grasping at something new and remains essentially preoccupied with itself instead of being preoccupied with the real issue. Again, speaking to this kind of almost predominant culture of new wounded narcissism. This is the culture we live in, the wounded narcissism, the trigger, trigger points and all that. You want to say something?
It's also already very psychoanalytic, right? About constantly saying kind of what you don't mean and sort of comes out in the broader structure of your speech.
Yes. No, that's good. That's a good point too. Yes. That's a very good point in the sense that you're being preoccupied instead of being preoccupied with the real issue, which are slips of the tongue, your slips of the pen, right? And you don't really mean what you say.
Right, like I
You're
want to change
unconscious.
saying it all the time, like stating your aim is kind of meaningless.
Yes, right, that's right. Stating goals. You know, this kind of brainwashing into careerism, you know, constantly, right? Okay? So, to judge a thing that has substance and solid worth is quite easy. To comprehend it is much harder. To blend judgment and comprehension as a definitive description is the hardest of all things. So think about this too, this phrase, to blend, this proposition, blending judgment and comprehension, right?
Yeah.
Is the hardest thing of all. Making the judgment, and in German, the Urteil means to separate, right? The judgment is an act of separation, right? And then, of course, understanding after that separation, right? Okay? So interesting, right? So culture and its laborious, number 4, emergence from the immediacy of substantial life must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view, so that at first to work up to a general conception of the real issue. How do we get to the asking not only the right question, you know, as the Greeks have taught us, and framing the question properly, right? But how do we get to the point of work up to the general conception? How do we put a general concept to work? Yeah, please.
Just to go back to that,
sure.
to blend judgment and comprehension in a definitive description is the hardest thing of all.
Right.
Is that, I'm just reading this section, you know, on Marx and the sort of the process of the concrete real and the concrete, the thought concrete. That's sort of what Marx is sort of aiming at that point too, is sort of this blending of judgment and comprehension. Could you read it that way? Or?
Yeah, and you're reading this in capital now, or?
Yeah, it's in capital, but it's like the, you know,
right.
the epistemological notion of.
Right.
So like.
I mean, this could be said in terms of something about, you know, what the Hegelian influence obviously is on Marx. I mean, we need judgments to go on, right? I mean,
Right.
We need to separate out things, and, you know, it's a great word, Urteil, it means to separate out, to sort out is what we're doing when we make this act of judging. But at the same time, the act of comprehension is the more difficult thing. Do we understand that judgment? How do we put them together, blend it together,
Right.
Movement together? You know, so you see the act of judgment, right? And look, I mean, this is where it becomes, I think, radical to my mind, and where it's interesting. You can read what is the justification for a theoretical legitimization? You have to look at two things, right? How did it basically, what judgment made that possible, right? That act, right? And then secondly, where is that understanding around? How did it come to be judged as an understandable theory?
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
So this is, I think, very, very interesting in this way, this process, right? I mean, it's a good way about going things. Where did the judgment in Marx come between the thought concrete and the real concrete?
Exactly.
What is the thought in the head? This is very Hegelian too.
Right.
And then the real out there, right?
And how you combine those things, you know, basically, or how they inform each other and
yes, exactly.
develop on each other.
What is the tension there through
Right.
the judgment and the understanding, right? And how did that come to be? Yeah. Okay. So good. Yeah. Culture, in its laborious emergence from the immediacy of substantial life, must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view to work up to a general conception. So we have to take into account, you know, a multi-perspectival view, right? And in order to get to general principles, then to come up with, quote, and this is why I call it the patience of the concept, right? How does the concept work? Of the real issue as well, learning to support, right? And refute the general conception with reasons. Right? How do we do this after we get the general concept? How do we support and refute it, right? Together. And apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification, and finally to give accurate instruction and pass serious judgment on it. So how does this process operate? From its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life and its concrete richness, and this leads the way to an experience of the real issue. And even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths, by serious speculative effort, and this is the first time he uses the word, and this again to me is the highest level of speculative philosophy, the Hegelian moment, right? This kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. The true shape, and this is very important, number 5, I would read this multiple times. The true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title, love of knowing, and be actual knowing. So you begin to see the differentiation here of philosophia, into actual knowing, right? No more the love or the friend of wisdom, right, as philosophy, but as actual knowing. This is what philosophy does, right? And to go back to what you were referring to, the epistemological issues at work. This is why I set myself to do. So again, we go from the aims of the work, if you want to think of this circularly, and number 1, right? If you want to backtrack and read a little bit again. Preface the work with the explanation of the aim after its aim. We don't get this until what I set myself to do, my task. Not only an aim, but it's really a task.
A process,
right?
Right?
Yeah, a process, right? So the inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature, right? Right? And only the systematic exposition of philosophy provides it. But the external necessity, so far as grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner, or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential elements or existence of its moments. To show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to a status of a science would therefore be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim, for to do so would demonstrate the necessity of the name, would indeed at the same time be the accomplishing of it. So we're going to go through the science of knowing, right?
Right.
The Wissenschaften, right? Good. And this is a crucial word in German. Weißen, Wissenschaften. The science of knowing, or what is known as the science of logic, right? But it's an active thing. It's not just the results, part of the process going through. Okay? So, what is philosophy's asking? Right? Do we talk about it or do we do it?
Right.
We obviously do it.
Right.
We don't talk about it. Yeah? Do we have a narrative which lacks conceptual dynamism? Right? What we're really going towards is conceptual dynamism, if you want to think of it that way. Philosophy can only be reenacted and not told. So we're taking away the telling or the narrative of philosophy, in a sense, okay? Because we're actually doing it, right? We're reenacting it.
I like that.
Okay? So think about this. You're an actress. Think about philosophy as an actor's, purview, that you're basically enacting and reenacting concepts in history, showing their shapes in consciousness. What you're really trying to do here is ultimately see the shapes of consciousness in the world. The skeptical, the stoical, the unhappy consciousness. You're going to be reading some of this when we get into self-consciousness. These gestalts, these figures and shapes and forms of consciousness. So to lay down that the true shape of truth is scientific. The shape of truth is scientific. It's not choosing multiplication tables, true and false, etc. Yeah? Or what is the same thing to maintain the truth as only the notion as its element of existence seems, I know, to contradict a view which in our time is prevalent as it is pretentious, and to go against what that view implies. Some explanation, therefore, seems called for, even though it must for the present be no more than a bare assertion, like the view that it contradicts. If, namely, the true exists only in what, or better as what, it is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute, religion or being, not at the center of divine love, but at the being of divine love itself, then what is required in the exposition of philosophy is, from this viewpoint, rather the opposite of the form of the notion. For the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, it is to be felt and intuitive, and not the notion of the absolute, but the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said and must be expressed by it. He's speaking of Schelling here, by the way. This is the process of intellectual intuition and divine love, right? And we're going to read a little bit from Schelling too, as I mentioned, I brought it last time, on the intellectual freedom.
When I read this
Okay, go ahead.
the first time,
Yeah.
because of my other philosophical deficits, I didn't really know what all the proper distinctions were between perception, sensation, cognition, intuition, concept, notion.
Right.
And so I actually went back to, I don't know if this is the right place to look for it, but I went back to Kant in the first book of the Transcendental Dialectic.
Right.
He gives a very clear delineation of sort of the genesis of those forms.
Right.
And in his definition of the concept is really, or the notion, is a concept made up of concepts. It's beyond the possibility of experience.
Right.
Sort of, I guess, sensual experience, ultimately.
Right.
Is that the way that Hegel sort of intends or uses it here? Or does he sort of abide by those Kantian definitions of the...
I don't know if he's
these
abiding
terms,
by it. I think his
taken,
antagonist here is more his friend Schelling,
Uh-huh.
right, who takes up this as intellectual intuition. The absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, which is also a Kantian position.
Mm-hmm.
God is such a notion, right? Or the absolute is such a notion we can hardly begin to conceptualize it. This is Kantian work, right? Right? And it is been or understood, and it is to be felt and intuited, right? This is all we can do is intuit that, right? And this is intellectual intuition at work. We intuit that, we need a ex machina, if
Right.
you will, or we need, somebody to guarantee, that we're not perfect, right? There must be something perfect outside, as Descartes would say, for us to have an idea of perfection, even though we're not perfect, right? Where do we get this idea from? This is the first step of the, ontological proof in the discourse on the method, and then later in the meditations on first philosophy. So
what's
I mean,
the
to
notion?
go back to your question, go ahead, I'm sorry.
What is the notion then? Just like, is there a definition of the way you use
Well, I
notion?
mean, what we should do, and maybe I should do this for you, is make you a distinct vocabulary. Maybe just give out a sheet next time. Notion, concept, right?
Yeah.
Begriffen, notion is lesser than the concept. It's on the way to the concept. Right?
Yeah, I have
Right.
the whole thing right here.
Okay, good. Okay, from Hegel or from
Kant.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do it from Hegel.
You started, in representation, then there's perception, sensation, cognition. There are two types of perception.
Right.
There are two types of cognition, intuition and concept.
Right.
Then there are two kinds of concepts, the empirical and the pure concept. Then there's the concept, made up of concept, which is the notion.
Right.
Okay, I just think it's like to me when I was going through all
No,
this,
I understand.
like all of the language, right,
Right.
and like I get the impression of what the concept is, and I have my own sort of impression of what concepts are, but to actually spell it out, to delineate it was helpful.
The etymology of the word concept is conceptio, from the Latin, which means to seize around.
To seize around.
Perceptio is to seize through.
I'll write that down.
Yep.
To seize through.
And the other is to seize around. Septio, the suffix of the term is really to seize. So you have a seizing around in a conceptualization, and in a perceptual, perceptive, you're basically seizing through. But I'll do something with notion, concept, understanding, force. I'll do a kind of vocabulary for you. I'll put that together next week because it'll probably help as we go forward.
I think it really
I mean, I'm reading into this his antagonist instead of just following the, I'm also contextualizing this. I'm doing like, this is what Hegel's thinking of and what he's reading at the time.
No, I understand,
That's what I'm trying to do. So,
So,
so anyway, So let's look. If we apprehend, a demand of this kind in its broader context, and the demand is obviously the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said and must be expressed by it, and view it as it appears at the stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it is clear that spirit has now gotten beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that is, beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness then had, and of its reconciliation with the essential being, and that of being's universal presence, both within and without. It has not yet gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection of itself into self, but beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of this life, of the finitude that is its own content, turning away from the empty costs and confessing that it lies in wickedness, it reviles itself for so doing, and now demands from philosophy not so much of knowledge what it is, as the recovery through the agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being, as a recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being. Philosophy is to meet this end, not by opening up the fast-locked nature of substance and raising this to self-consciousness, not by bringing consciousness out of its chaos back to an order based on thought, nor to the simplicity of the notion, but rather running together, and this is important, where thought is put asunder by suppressing the differentiations of the notion and restoring the feeling of the essential being. In short, by providing edification rather than insight. Okay? And this is going on again in the process of the Offenbach. The beautiful, the holy, the eternal, religion and love are the bait required to arise, the desire to bite. Not the notion, but ecstasy, not the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, but the ferment of enthusiasm. These are supposed to be what sustain and continually extends the wealth of substance. Okay? In keeping with this demand is the strenuous, almost overzealous present attempt to tear men away from their preoccupation with the sensuous, from their ordinary private affairs, and to direct their gaze to the stars. Okay? So this passage is interesting because I think it was Heine, or someone went to see Hegel, and he said, "What do you see in the starry, starry night?" Van Gogh or whatever. "What do you see in the heavens and the heavenly ecstasies?" And Hegel pointed to the floor. "It's the shit down here we're interested in," which is interesting. But here you can see where Heine would be getting this from, right? As if they were forgotten all about the divine and were ready like worms to content themselves with dirt and water. Formerly they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. The meaning of all that is hung on the thread of light by which was linked to that heaven. Instead of dwelling in this world's presence, men looked beyond it, following this thread to an otherworldly presence, so to speak. The eye of the spirit had to be forcibly turned and held fast to the things of this world. And it took a long time before the lucidity, which only heavenly things used to have, could penetrate the dullness and confusion in which the sense of worldly things were enveloped, and so made attention to the here and now as such attention to what has been called, again, experience, an interesting and valid enterprise. Now we seem to need just the opposite. Sense is so fast-rooted in earthly things that it requires just as much force to raise it. The spirit shows itself as so impoverished, like a wanderer in the desert craving for a mere mouthful of water. It seems to crave for its refreshment only the bare feeling of the divine in general. But by the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of the loss. Okay? Any thoughts about this? You know, again, the attention to the here and now is very important for Hegel. The thisness of the here and now is very, very important. We're going to go back to this. I want to use that as a phrase.
So we're trying to get away from this like spiritual notion of, you know.
We're certainly trying to get away from the spiritual notions, right? In a way.
That's what
but we want to retain the term Geist,
right?
Which is spirit, but also is
how
now
can I put
being
it better?
retranslated as community. This is the phenomenology, if you will, the logic of the appearance that appear to us in the presence, in the here and now, of the Spirit's manifestation, the Geist as it proceeds through the long march of historical and, self-consciousness.
Maybe like mindfulness or something he's kind of referring to, like in contemporary terms. You'd be like, for now, you would say like, oh, everybody's concerned with mindfulness or philosophy or something, and you'd be like...
Yeah, but mindfulness to him would be part of the fashion.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the laborious,
so he wants to get rid of
back
that.
to what's going on here, not the laborious movement of the diversity of a philosophical system.
Well,
that's what we're impoverished.
Satisfy the spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of thing. Astrology.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
The stars fall down to earth. Very good piece by Adorno on Hollywood and astrology. The stars fall down to earth.
It seems like, is he also critiquing empiricism here, because he's saying like, okay, we went to experience now, and we can like measure things, but like that's also not enough.
Yeah, let me just point out something. Look, I know that, these words are used, and they're used a lot, and, the literature, and especially in theoretical literature, abstract and concrete.
Uh-huh.
We're still in the frozen, and with Hegel, we're in the frozen wasteland of abstraction. We have not really reached the concrete. The same thing in Marx in a certain way. The movement from the abstract to the concrete is what we're always doing, but we never really have reached the concrete. We're still mired in abstractions. So you have to think of abstractions not as the way we use it in English, you're too abstract. You have to think about abstraction as a process of pulling away, holding away, etc. And we're still always doing that. And we're in the frozen moment, right? Sometimes fixed in that abstraction. And this is what Hegel's up to here. There are many, many levels. The task here, again, is to be able to think in levels of abstraction and also not go back, as what you pointed out, to the empirical, so-called concrete, or what we could just call the empirical tangible. Yeah.
So you're saying that in the what we have right now is abstract. We define everything individually without any interconnection between them, which would be the concrete.
It wouldn't be the concrete, it would be the process of going towards
the concrete, right. And we have not yet attained the concrete.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
We have not philosophy is not outdated because it has not reached its fulfillment. This is a Hegelian thing.
Yeah. Okay.
The beginning of Adorno's negative dialectics.
Exactly.
That's what he's speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy has not missed its moment because its moment has not passed.
Interesting.
Right? So think about it that way in so many ways. Why philosophy is still necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Both the teaching of and the doing of.
Right.
This reenactment constantly. Right? Yeah. And this to me is a kind of, this is a building block in terms of system and method that's, basically taken on by Nietzsche, inverted and transformed by Marx, right? Used by Lacan and Kojève as a reinterpretation and another kind of reenactment, but it becomes a building block in 1807, and of course the logic too, which we'll see in the course on
with
method.
Arta.
Yeah, is something else, right? So we're trying to, again, I'm sorry, I know you come on Tuesdays, but Monday is the pre-Socratics. And I'm trying to, I thought this through with my quote, comrades, right? That, you would do, the pre-Socratics in terms of setting up the first enactment, if you will, of the philosophical scene, in a way. And then you would move on to, the Hegelian reenactment of all the philosophical scenes through concepts. And you notice you don't see any proper names.
No, yeah, none.
No proper names.
I like that too.
It's
Well, you
amazing.
said
You have to begin to think.
Don't get
Conceptually,
fixated.
you're not thinking Lacan or Derrida or Lyotard or whatever. You're thinking conceptually. You really, and this is part of the task here. In many ways. And then we're also doing method on, we're teaching a method on Wednesday with Arto. And so in that we'll talk about Aristotelian method all the way up, hopefully, to dialectical method, although dialectics, originally meant the art of conversation.
How many sessions has that met already?
It's only met once, and we're not meeting
It's
tomorrow.
online.
We're gonna meet, and it's online if you want to catch up too.
And tomorrow we're not doing it.
No, we're not doing it tomorrow because we're gonna be away. Tomorrow we're
Right. So it's next week.
Yeah, that one I did want to do.
You
that.
should come because it's a good one.
I work on
Yeah.
Monday.
And I mean Monday is online too, so we're trying to integrate all of this, and we'll see what we can do with the Saturday, class when we can elevate there. Anyway, so okay. I mean, I have many notes here. I'll share them with you as we go on. I don't want to overdo it. So until we get into it. But do you get a little bit of the feeling here? I mean, what I'm trying to do, again, is, vis-a-vis Hippolyte, sensitize us to the reading of the text. So the reason I'm reading out loud is to get into how Hegel operates. I mean, again, this is not German. It's the English translation. It's a great advance on the previous translation. All of us, I mean, that were studying philosophy in the 70s, we're so happy when this came out because the earlier edition was terrible. The Bailey,
And they have this little translation section in the back of it's like summaries of each proposition.
Oh, the analysis of the text. Good.
Which is actually helpful too.
Good.
If you
Well,
get
we
stuck.
can look at things. He goes on the use of what we just read, number 7. Right? The disillusioned desire to return to the peace and security of faith, right? Let me be serene in God once again, right?
I wondered if, it kind of reminded me of what you were saying about Heidegger, like the recovery of substantial being is maybe like one example of philosophy doing that.
Right. Let me just say this about substantial being. For Heidegger and for being in general, it's not substance. Okay? Well, we'll talk about that too.
It's like nothing.
More.
Almost.
Yeah. It's not substantive.
Okay.
I mean, once you can get over that kind of thinking, you're on the road towards doing more ontology than just doing, the regular.
Sorry, can you clarify what you mean? I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, being is not a substance.
Right.
Okay? Yeah.
Yeah, when he says substantial being, am I right in thinking that he means like a sort of sense of integration in the community, maybe, and like a feeling of, lack of alienation in some way?
Where does he say the substance of being?
Fullness? You mean?
He says at the bottom of 7, like he says people like crave from philosophy recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being.
Yeah, that's religious.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not Heideggerian. That's the religious.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, that's the religious. And what he's really talking about here is that people that seek that out are seeking out, not cold insight or not,
God gives me a
insight.
purpose, right? Like, God gives me a purpose in the world, and I understand the world this way.
Right.
I think that's what he means.
Right.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. So 8 is a return to the heaven gate, the view from the mountain. But he also brings up this word experience, right? And this again, we're looking at the science of the experience of consciousness. The object, if you will, of the Wissenschaften is of the structure and the experience of consciousness. Bewusstsein in German. We may be able to retrieve this, put a semicolon, the phenomenology of spirit, right? The science, right, of the experience of consciousness. Okay? I'll just add that, for right now. Yeah? Okay? Yeah?
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay? So, then he goes on. This is very interesting. This modest complacency in receiving or the sparingness in giving does not, however, befit science. Whoever seeks mere edification and whoever wants to shroud in a mist that manifold variety of the earthly existence and of thought in order to pursue the indeterminate enjoyment of this indeterminate divinity may look where he likes to find all this. He will find ample opportunity to dream up something for himself. But philosophy must beware of the wish to be edifying. And that's very important, right? And Kierkegaard makes fun of this, by the way.
Really?
You go to Kierkegaard of the edifying consciousness, right? He's for the edifying consciousness in some of his works. Kierkegaard said Hegel figured out everything, but he left out man. Right? So
yeah,
we'll talk about that as we go. On the singular and the singular universal. We'll talk more about that. Okay? Later on again. I hope I can get to all of this. Still less must this complacency, and again, what he's really trying to do is awaken you, like Kant did from your dogmatic slumbers, like Hume did for Kant, in edition B of the critique of, to awaken you from dogmatic slumbers, right? He's trying to awaken you from ordinary, commonplace, conventional experience, right?
Yeah.
Take you out of the ordinary, put you in the place of where you're very discomfort and, thing. I'm not, in a way, it's a good thing. People don't understand this. To feel your alienation, to experience it, all of these things is very positive, in a way. The way people speak, I'm alienated. I feel lost. All of these are positive things if you would go with the experience and then the process could take place. In a sense. We've forgotten this today in this era of,
edification.
Diversity, edification of narcissistic wounds everywhere. Trigger words all the time. I ask my students today, are there any trigger words? Oh no, Professor, we love your vocabulary. I was very lucky to get got out of that one. So it's good. Okay, so let's look more. So complacency, what philosophy does is it shapes you, right? It solicits. It's probably a better way of putting it. You're solicited, in a certain way. You're called to, right? In a sense, this is what it's doing. It's supposed to wake you up and scare the shit out of you, at least in the beginning, right? So that you can get going, right? All right. Still less must this combine, which abjures science, claim that such rapturous haziness is superior to science. This prophetic talk supposes that it's staying right in the center and in the depths, looks disdainfully at determinateness, oros, and deliberately holds aloof from notion and necessity as products of that reflection which is at home only in the finite. But just as there is an empty breath, so there is an empty depth. And just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as a finite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together, so there's an intensity without content, one that holds itself in a sheer force without spread. And this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality. The power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in the exposition. So you have to be not afraid of losing yourself in terms of pulling yourself out of the position. To expose, right? Or to out of your position, right? Out of the positing, if you will, again, right? Moreover, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have some idiosyncrasy of the self and essential being, and to philosophize in the true and holy matter, it hides the truth from itself by spurning measure and definition instead of being devoted to God, and merely gives free rein both to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice. Such minds, when they give themselves up to the uncontrollable ferment of the divine substance, imagine that by drawing a veil over self-consciousness and surrendering understanding, they become the beloved of God, to whom he gives wisdom in sleep, and hence what they in fact receive and bring to birth in their sleep is nothing but dreams. He's very good here, and he's going after his friend Shelley. They were very good friends. They planted the tree of liberty, but they ended up on opposite sides, in their philosophical work. Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours, and this is important too, and I like this, is a birth time and a transition to a new era. So this is the herald, if you will. This is the sign of the future. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap and the child is born. Interesting, right? So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into a new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted by isolated symptoms. The frivolity, and this next section is very good, the frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown, these are the heralds of approaching change. The gradual crumbling that left unaltered in the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which in one flash illuminates the features of the new world. So this is really Hegel now talking well beyond these other frivolities and superficialities here. So, okay? So he's now speaking of, and you can see the transitions and how he's working. You're negating, this nostalgic return to God, right? You're also negating, right? The notion of intellectual intuition, right? And also, you want to also negate the beautiful, the holy, the eternal, and religion and love, right? And you're doing so in the cold march, if you will, of necessity to the thing itself, or in the thing itself, right? So. And you want to get yourself out of only the sensuous, right? From their ordinary private affairs and direct your gaze to the stars, right? In a sense, he's also talking about this view, right, of the heavenly firmament that now is starting to herald this new age of spirit. So you can see the terminology, it really fits in terms of both the world's historical spirit, we'll talk about that as well when we get into this more, and you're also going to see spirit unfolding, right, throughout this with that kind of language. But it's against enthusiasm, overzealousness, etc. Because underlying this, again, is the dialectical logic, which is a knife edge, always cutting and separating through the judgment, right, and the understanding. So if you can keep that in mind as you read this, it would be great. You can retain that. So retain that, yeah. So, right? When we see an oak with its massive trunk and spreading branches and foliage, we're not content to be shown an acorn instead. And this is interesting, this thing. So too, science, the crown of a world, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. It is the whole which, having traversed its content in time and space, has returned into itself, and the resultant simple notion of the whole. But the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, which now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, this time in their newly acquired meaning. And this is very important too, because you begin to see new meaning happen in these new forms and concepts. You want to start talking about this way. How does a word transform? So when Josh brings in the Kantian transcendental, deduction to the category, and certain terms such as intuition, understanding, concept, and Kant, Hegel is transforming these, right, into something different, into a new meaning, right, into a new meaning, yeah? And hence the word septio and conceptio, to seize around, is giving you a new meaning, right? I mean, he's really doing this, and this is very, very important how we get there, right? And anyway, yeah, okay. So try to keep this in mind.
I don't think he transforms the words.
Okay, that's all right.
Not so much like I think he uses them. I think he goes much further.
Okay.
Which maybe is a transformation.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that too. I mean, those are good questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the initial appearance of the new world is, to begin with, only the whole veiled in its simplicity, or the general foundation, although the wealth of previous existence is still present to consciousness in memory. Right? Consciousness misses in the newly emerging shape its former range and specificity of content, and even more the articulation of form whereby distinctions are securely defined and stand arrayed in their fixed relations. Without such articulation, and this is important how science works, science lacks universal intelligibility and gives the appearance of being the esoteric possession of a few individuals. An esoteric possession, since it is not yet present only in its notion or its inwardness. Of a few individuals, since its undiffused manifestation makes its existence something singular. Only what is completely determined is at once esoteric, comprehensible, and capable of being learned and appropriate by all. The intelligible form of science is the way open and easily accessible to everyone, and consciousness as an approach to science justly demands that it is able to attain to rational knowledge by way of the ordinary understanding. For the understanding is thought, the pure eye is such, and what is intelligible is already familiar and common to science, and the unscientific consciousness of life. The latter through having afforded direct access to the former. So these next sections, right, are really talking about, what is science, what is Wissenschaften, what does it mean in many ways to the Hegelian system, right?
Yeah.
Again, if you want to do this by numbers, and we didn't read this, but the formative process of science, proposition 29, right, is important to understand that. I'm going to try to do it this way just a little bit with you. The science of the truth, number 38. And then you begin to see mathematical truths, 42, and mathematical knowing. Very important too in here. And there have been some very good books on Hegel and mathematics. Platinsky, I think it did one book on him. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so so just to talk a little bit more about science, right, in that regard. Okay, so
but just to go back to that section about acquiring new meaning. I mean, that's Marx all over the place, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. That's
How do you transform
yeah.
how do you provide the space, right, if you will,
Mhm.
or that kind of, suppressed space where
Mhm.
new meaning then becomes possible.
Yeah.
This is Althusser at work too,
Yeah.
in many ways. His Hegelian influence on Althusser is very, even though
It
he
stays.
doesn't claim it,
Yeah.
it certainly stays. Yeah.
And even in the section 11 where he says,
Yeah.
what does he say? A new
Proposition,
child is
yeah.
born,
Yeah.
I mean, that's rupture right there, it seems to me,
It's rupture. Yes.
So while he sort of removes Hegel from Marx, Althusser, you can sort of say that it remains there nonetheless.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a Hegelian residue in
Yeah.
Althusser, just like there is in Marx. People
yeah.
want to rid Marx of Hegel, especially the Marx of the later period, or,
Mhm.
what's considered the humanist versus the anti-humanist or ahumanist Marx.
Mhm.
So, this is
But I guess if it's dialectical, then you always retain parts of the old system.
dialectical and Hegelian sense.
Yeah.
Is there retention? Because you remember that for Deleuze and Guattari, Hegel remains pious, but let's see his destructions. The Aufhebung, I don't know if you know this term, but I put it on the board. The Aufhebung, which is the suppression, the lifting higher, but there is a retention that's always going on in the spherical movement. So you should be, when you're really reading this, your mind should be kind of, going with the process and the unfolding of what's happening here. And the unfolding is really spirit. It's really Geist. Right? Think about it that way. Geist and knowing. Geist and understanding. Right? To think about this, right? What is the idea there? And how do we get to someone there?
Yeah, there's a woman.
The police is here.
Security? It's only 8:25. She at the door?
No, she was just looked at.
Oh, there, it's the signs of the police. Yeah. So Hegel is, going through this destruction, right? It's happening, right? And always as you're going forward. But you still have this kind of concentricity, this circular movement, right? The beginning is the end. The end is the result of the beginning. And what you're trying to do is clear the ground of any kind of suppositions. The attempt here is to get to presuppositionalist philosophy. This is what speculative philosophy does. To look at what is the presupposed here. And this is what he's trying to do, to get us out of this taking for granted kind of thinking, that we already have an idea of what restaurant we're going to go to. We already have an idea about something out there, right? How someone's going to react, and makes us lose not only the sense of the phenomenon, the meaning of the phenomenon, but of course the spirit of the phenomenon. Right? This is always something, we're awakening. Philosophy is an awakening process. And the birth of consciousness as well. This is the thinker of modern consciousness. This is the culmination, if you will, of the egocentricity of the 17th century in philosophy, in Descartes. The ego in Lacan's, formulation is a paranoid construct. The philosophers, Leo Strauss, are paranoids, right? And they build systems that are massive defense mechanisms, right? And you can see this at work here. But at the same time, Hegel will take this to the level of self-consciousness, and its movement in history, right? And how this master-slave dialectic works. But we have to talk about everything from the external to the internal, movement of subject and object, all these things that are happening, right? Substance and cause, force and understanding. And you can look at the structure of the book. The book, again, is very, dialectical in its creation of the tensions, right? Right? Yeah, very, very much, in the sense. Sense certainty or the this and meaning, Do we really learn through our sensuality, our sensuousness and sense certainty? Or can we be certain by our senses under this? Perception or the thing and deception. How does our perception deceive us? Many, many times. And this is all going through concepts, the history of philosophy, right? Not through its polemics and disagreements, but through its movement, right? Through its movement. And then force in the understanding, appearance, and the super-sensible world is certainly a reference to Kant and to Newton, right?
Yeah.
Force in the supersensible is Newton's force, and the supersensible of Kant, right?
Yeah.
He knows his history. Yeah.
Oh, completely.
Yeah, no question about it. Yeah, this is a monster.
I mean, yeah, in my
the eagle. This is really the eagle. If you do a surrealist thing, this is the ego. Is the eagle of philosophy. He's perched. He's the owl of Minerva. Which reflects on the day and the day's residue. The old wise owl, right? That appears only at dusk. That reflects on all the day's activity. And he's also the eagle that is seen from heights, simultaneously to the ground. So you have a figure ground always working in Hegel. It's very impressive. Feet on the ground, head in the air, if you will, in terms of the posture. Right? Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry, yeah. Got a few minutes.
No, I guess I was just gonna. My impression of his treatment of Kant and Newton and all the Cartesian stuff too is that he doesn't say that it's wrong. It's just sort of naive. It's just the first step in the process of.
Part of our passage here, and I use consciousness loosely throughout, is going to be from natural consciousness to self-consciousness, to consciousness. And then how does that passage go to reason? What then is reason here? Yeah, and this is what the idealist tradition really leaves us. This is its legacy. Is reason the French Revolution? Is it the things we struggle for? Are these part of reason? How did we get to equality? Liberty, right? Absolute terror and freedom. Well, all these things really playing out. What is he thinking? Yeah. So I don't want to be historicist about this. This is a charge that was leveled against Susan Buck Morris, that she's very historicist, that he's only reflecting on Toussaint in the Hegel and Hades book, right? And not the greater Hegelian project is at work.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true.
Right. So, yeah. Well, anyway, we'll talk about that.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Right. So, next time, why don't we pick up, I guess, with substance and subject, right? And why don't we read up until, and I'll put an email to this effect too. Why don't we read all the way to through mathematical truths? I think we could do that.
What number is that?
50, proposition number, let's look all the way up to the triadic form.
Okay.
Let's go to page 30 through number 50 on the triadic form. Okay?
I guess, yeah.
You guess? Or
we have to, right? Because we don't have enough time.
Well, we can go slower. I don't mind, but for me, I can turn this into, I'll do it. I'll just give extra stuff and we'll pick up.
Yeah, let's do it, and we
can always go back.
Yeah.
Look, number 40. I'm just going to point out, highlight a few things. Vis-a-vis today, the dogmatic thing. Dogmatism is a way of thinking. Number 40, page 23. Whether an ordinary knowing and study of philosophy is nothing else but the opinion that the true consists in a proposition which is a fixed result or which is immediately known. To such a question, when was Caesar born, or how many feet were there in the stadium, a clear-cut answer ought to be given, just as it is definitely true that the square of the hypothesis is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. But the nature of a so-called truth of this kind is different from the nature of philosophical truths. These are dogmatic truths, right? I know sports very well, statistics. I can cite batting averages, statistics in the NFL. I follow this. I have a mind that kind of takes to that easily. But those are dogmatic, facts and truth. I'm not doing anything interesting there. I'm just, quote, memorizing and repeating, you know, in a sense. I could use this. I mean, a good thing here would be sports analytics, how people start to think about sports analytics as well. Yep, okay? So and then historical truth. So we're going to see this with dogmatic, true and false, right? And dogmatic truths, and then mathematical truths. So this is, again, I like the way of starting with this, because I think you get a sense of the breadth of this undertaking, you know? And he's only, at this time, 37 years old, right? He's born 1770, and he dies in 1831. This is 1807. He's 37 years old when he's doing this, right? And etc. And I'll talk more about the system, you know, itself and the method going forward. So any questions or anything else we would like? I mean, I also want to emphasize the triadic form, right? Number 50 must not be regarded as scientific when it's reduced to a lifeless schema, a mere shadow. Yeah, Kant rediscovered this triadic form, and the proper name, one of very few proper names throughout the book. On page 29, this triadic form by instinct, but in his work it is still lifeless and uncomprehending. Since then it has been raised to its absolute significance, and with it the true form and its true content has been presented, so the notion of science has emerged. This formalism, of which we have already spoken generally, and its style we wish to describe in more detail, imagine is comprehended and expressed the nature and life of a form which is endowed with some determination of the schema as a predicate. And this is where he's going to be talking about predicates and predications. Very important to the philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
What is an idealist predication versus a materialist predication? Yeah. Okay? So we're going to talk about it. We'll actually engage that too. Yeah. Okay? Yep. And I'll make a point this weekend, probably Sunday. I'll put together a little vocabulary, you know, with definite, you know, concept, idea, substance, you know, a notion, right? Yeah.
Yeah, take a look at this little
Okay.
paragraph here.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, I know this, yeah.
I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah, this is Kant, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very good, yeah. But let me, you know, I'll go back to this, you know, and I'll try to work out how Hegel does it differently.
Okay.
Okay?
Sounds good.
We'll work that way too. We'll be doing philosophy instead of just talking about it. Right? Good. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah.